Hi everybody, my name is Carter Shirley and this is my presentation about Pakistan and their constitution of 1956. So something I wanted to talk about first is the history of Pakistan. So Pakistan first gained its independence from the Indian Independence Act of 1947. This was right after World War II, and as you can see in the image to the right, you have West Pakistan and East Pakistan. And these countries were created after the Great Partition, which we learned last week. So East Pakistan was part of Pakistan, but now we know it as Bangladesh. So Pakistan didn't have a form of government when it got its independence, so it used the Government of India Act of 1935 that Britain gave them, and it allowed them to use that constitution until they created their own 9 years later. Their constitution that they created unfortunately only lasted for about two years. And the reason for that is the process of how they wanted to set up the government never really happened. For example, their elections for their parliament was never implemented. And this led for the constitution eventually failing on October 7th, 1958, when martial law was enforced. So the president and his cabinet. So this is the first of the three parts of government inside Pakistan. So the rule for the president is he had to be part of the Muslim faith. And in order for him to be president, he also had to be 40 years old and a Muslim citizen. So much like the United States, their terms were only for 2 times. But unlike the United States, they were able to do it for 5 years. The president had the ability to veto bills, and especially bills regarding taxes, where they had to have his consent in order for them to be enacted. The president also appoints the prime minister, and this is much like the vice president inside the United States, where he is part of the legislative branch. And on the right, you can see that's the first president of Pakistan. So their legislative branch, or their parliament, was called the National Assembly. This is a unicameral legislature, which means that they only had one form. They didn't have a House and a Senate, they just had one. And this consisted of 300 members, and half of them from East Pakistan and half of them from West Pakistan. So, for the age limit, in order to be on a candidate for the parliament, you had to be at least 25 years old. And they were chosen and elected by the people, much like us today when we elect our congressmen. In order to be an adult to elect somebody, you had to be at least 21 years old to vote. So the National Assembly, they were supposed to meet at least 2 times a year, and they had a rule of 3/4 majority vote was able to impeach the president. A fun fact about the National Assembly is out of the 300 spots, they had an additional 10 spots, which were primarily just for women. They also had a Supreme Court. Much like the United States, it served as a mediator between the president and the National Assembly, or the executive and the legislative branch. It also served as the final interpretation of the Constitution, and it was also the highest of the courts. And like the United States, we have courts inside each state. They also had district courts and Sharia courts. So the reason why it was not implemented, and it took 9 years to implement their constitution, was broken down into immediate issues and long-term issues. The immediate issues was a large amount of refugees, which they had to take care of the refugees before they could figure out what to do with the constitution. They also had the canal water dispute with India, and it was when India cut one of their canals and they were losing water for their crops, and it was a big mess, but they resolved it with India. And the lack of financial and military assets that India promised them, but they never got. So those were some things that they had to gain as they continued on. Some of the longer term issues was on the right hand side, you can see this person. He was pretty much the founder of Pakistan, and he died, and he created a lot of political rivalry and corruption with people wanting to take control or take part of the government. Party representation, which was eventually resolved with the half and half, and choice of national language. The national language was English, but there were different disputes with the language, so they had to choose between one of them. Those were some of the longer term issues. And this is my presentation, and these are my citations about where I got my resources and also where I got my photos. Thank you for listening.